Good morning, everyone. My name is Anton Shkaruba. I'm a researcher at the Estonian University of Life Sciences in Tartu in Estonia. Today we'll start a small series of sessions about governance and management of a nuclear disaster, which is a part of intense, massive open online course on energy development and sustainable energy. Why we're talking about this? We didn't have so far a lot of large-scale nuclear disasters. If precisely we had only three, or by some other estimates, four. Nevertheless, they do happen, and it is at least useful to understand what happens next and what can be response to nuclear disaster from societies and from the states. That's why we decided to have a little part of our MOOC focusing on this particular issue. Today I'm starting with this topic, and today I will talk about the Chernobyl accident, its fallout, and the first response to the Chernobyl accident. Here is the outline. First, I will give a short overview on Chernobyl nuclear accident. Luckily, a recent HBO series on Chernobyl did a lot of my job, so I will be very short. Then we'll move to radioactive fallout pollution in the three most affected countries, which are Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And we're gonna talk a little bit about exposure to and the impacts of ionizing radiations, and we'll discuss a little bit what are disaster-prone societies, what makes them disaster-prone, what are the possible adaptation deficits, and what are the causes of the possible adaptation deficits. The disaster occurred on April 26th of 1986. Basically, it was an outcome of an experiment which apparently was unsuccessful. Safety test system was turned off, and different tests of energy production were run. The result was a huge destructive steam explosion and subsequent open air graphite fire. The fire was contained only in several days by May 4, 1986. And what is important, the plums of nuclear fission products, they were released and precipitated over whole Europe. The plum reached higher tropospheric levels, and it really traveled across the whole European continent, as you can see on this map. This map shows distribution of cesium-137. This is widespread and a lighter radioactive element, and it can travel on larger distances. Also, it's very hazardous to human health. And virtually not place in Europe was left unaffected by the Chernobyl explosion. This map shows the most polluted areas in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. So you can see that the most polluted areas they are in Belarus, near Chernobyl, and also there is another quite large spot between the cities of Mogilyovo and Homel. And the smaller and less intensively polluted areas can be found in Russia. If you're interested in specific figures of cesium-137 pollution in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, you can find them on this table. Apparently, in terms of area, speaking about the most polluted area, Belarus suffered the most, which was a bit unpredicted consequences of this disaster. Indeed, the most affected areas were just around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Those pictures were taken in towns of Pripyat. This was a brand new town built specifically for workers of Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and in the town of Chernobyl. Those pictures are iconic now. You can see all those deserted public spaces, schools, houses. It's really awful. It is important that in order to mitigate the consequences of Chernobyl disaster, to fight the fire, quite huge resources were employed, and they were employed in a very extremely efficient way. People from all over former Soviet Union have been mobilized to fight the Chernobyl disaster, to mitigate its immediate consequences, and it's truly impressive, like what a large scale power was there. Importantly, because many of those people who participated in mitigation, in fighting against Chernobyl disaster and its fire, and who innocently fired, who didn't have any connection to Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Many of those people suffered and they lost their health. Many of them died. And in all the three countries, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, you can find a lot of monuments commemorating those people. And the sign you can read in the middle of this slide is, you can hear us, the Lord. We are those who save our planet in that April, which is very factual truth. There are several ways for countries, nations, societies to measure how well societies are prepared for disasters. Internationally recognized one is Sendai framework that was adopted for the period of 2015 to 2030 by an international treaty. Here we can see what are the main priorities under Sendai disaster risk reduction framework. First of all, we need to understand disaster risk, and this involves high costs for risk assessments, for research, for studies of preparedness, studies of possible response, studies of actual risks, and so on. Then also we need to strengthen disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. So our governance institutions and structures should be built in a way that in case if disaster happens, if any emergency happens, we need to be ready to confront it and to mitigate it and then to adapt to it. Then also we need to invest in disaster risk reduction for resilience. Society that's going to be exposed to the consequences of any disaster needs to stay resilient, and we need to find the specific features of that society that help it to stay resilient, and we need to improve the capacity of this society to stay resilient. And the last priority is enhancing disaster preparedness for effective responses and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So in case if disaster happens, we need to know what to do and how exactly to react to the consequences of this disaster and to rebuild society as fast as possible. Another way to look at disaster-prone societies comes from IPCC reports, and this efforts, I believe, was quite nice. This classification came from the IPCC report of 2001, and it lists the following things which are important for a society to be disaster prone. Those are available technological options, resources, structures of critical institutions and decision-making authorities, the stock of human capital, the stock of social capital, the system's access to risk spread and process, information management and the credibility of information supplied by decision makers, and at last, the public's perception of risks and exposure. So this is not in conflict with the principles and priorities of Sendai framework, but still gives perhaps a little bit of out-of-box understanding what else can be considered as important things for a society to be disaster prone. This society was extremely well prepared to any kind of nuclear disaster. This was because it was an expectation at high political floors that sooner or later a large-scale nuclear war will start. And Soviet society and Soviet people needed to be well prepared for this. And quite huge infrastructure, informational, educational, institutional, physical, has been developed to counteract nuclear consequences of a nuclear war and to prepare the society to survive in this nuclear war. And looking at all those information materials from those times, you can see actually how serious those preparations were and how well Soviet society as such was prepared to any kind of nuclear disaster threats. Say on this picture you can see instructions for civil population to act on signals of civil defense organization. So what basically people needed to do when a nuclear attack would start. So you see instructions about how kids should be protected in case of any nuclear threat is emerging. So specific instructions for schools, for kindergartens and adults, what to do to protect the kids. Here you can see some quite detailed instructions of what are the individual preparations of apartments and individual houses should be in order to survive under a nuclear attack. This slide specifically instructs how drinking water and food supplies need to be prepared for the nuclear disaster, and what to do after a nuclear disaster in terms of food and drink water consumption. The poster shows what an individual remedy kit with all kind of remedies and pharmacies looks like, and what remedies help in what situation. And those standard kits were available in great plenty. I remember when I was a kid and was a school kit in a Soviet school, we had a great many of them stored in a dedicated space. So they were available upon the first request when they needed. Indeed, in order to keep everyone ready and alert to a nuclear disaster, a lot of training activities were run. For instance, this poster shows like what kind of training and how the success of training should be tested in case of gas masks. This poster shows how to put a gas mask quickly on a kit, and people also needed to pass a special test. This poster shows what an individual radioactivity indicator looks like, and they needed some training to understand how to work with this thing. And this is quite old and quite robust technology. Say this specific piece of equipment comes from 1970. And what was quite amazing is a sharp contrast between how well the society was prepared to the disaster and how, in fact, it responded to this disaster. On the left, you see the column of buses evacuating kids from Chernobyl and Pripyat to other areas in Ukraine, and like this evacuation action was not taken immediately. It took quite some time to get the kids together and to move them out of these affected cities and from other affected settlements. And basically on the same day, kids in other parts of Europe were warned not to stay outside for too much. And you see this picture was taken in Austria, and it says that the playground is closed, so like kids were not encouraged to stay outside. They were encouraged to stay home because it was known that there are higher background levels of radiation, and it's better not to be exposed to it. And this picture shows a parade on the Labor Day on the 1st of May, just several days after the Chernobyl accident in one of the cities not far away from Chernobyl, the city of Mogilov in Belarus. So basically in all over Soviet Union, the Labor Day was a very important day with people parading, picnicking, especially when the weather is as lovely as it was on that day. And apparently a lot of people got exposed to high doses of radiation, to different radionuclides, because nobody was warned about the disaster and about the potential danger of staying outside on these days. What is so challenging about radioactive pollution and about managing it? First of all, this is a problem that brings a huge uncertainty. Radioactive pollution hits absolutely every aspect of human life and every aspect of society function, be it health system, education, food production, food consumption, energy generation, you just name it. And also in itself, the problem is extremely complex. This is due to its physics and due to its chemistry and due to its biology. And the first thing that made the management of Chernobyl disaster so difficult and so challenging was the problem of managing it within institutions of human society. On this picture, just gave it here for demonstration purposes, you see the structure of organization, the structure of institutions in the Republic of Belarus of our days. responsible for managing aftermath of Chernobyl disaster. Just imagine these complex organizational schemes with all those links and interlinkages emerged after the actual disaster took place. So this is more or less established organizational structure, and still it looks pretty chaotic. Just imagine what it was during the first days of the disaster, when like nobody knows what exactly his responsibility, where it ends, when it starts. And this is the most nightmarish thing for any bureaucratic structure, not to be even aware of what you're allowed and what you're permitted to do, what are your boundaries, and so on. So the whole thing basically failed in this respect. Then also the biophysical system is extremely uncertain. So on this in this table you see the most important radionuclides found in the Chernobyl plum. And you see that in terms of physical properties, these radionuclides, they're extremely different in terms of their half-life, in terms of the activity they released, but also they have very different chemical properties. And like the whole chemistry and the whole physics of Chernobyl radiation was extremely complex. Importantly, also there are different types of radiation, and all kind of ionizing radiation was abundantly present in the Chernobyl plum, and population people were exposed to all kinds of radiation. That included alpha particle. They have short range. They have relatively dense track of ionization. So basically, they cannot travel too far away, but they are very deadly in terms of exposure. Then there are beta particles. They can travel further. They can penetrate some materials, but the energy is a bit low. And then there is a gamma radiation. Those are not particles. Those are waves, and then they can easily penetrate quite a lot of materials. But again, the energy of gamma radiation is even lower than beta radiation. Also, importantly, due to different physical properties of radionuclides and the ability to travel different distances, and also due to complex meteorological situation and due to complexities related to landscape structures, the precipitation pattern of Chernobyl radionuclides was extremely complex. So basically, in one area you can have an extremely high level of radioactive pollution, and just in 100 meters, even less from this area, it can be completely clean of any kind of artificial radiation. So you see on these forest maps that, is really very, very, very patchy. Then also there are many uncertainties in terms of human health effects. We know about cancer risks. They're considered small for low doses, but also like it's extremely difficult to make any conclusions on actual impact in case of low doses. For low to medium doses, those risks are considerably higher. Also, we know about negative genetic effects, and exposure of reproductive tissues may lead to changes in genetic materials. We know about effects on human fertility. And indeed, we know about many impacts on human fetus, and both low and high doses of radiations can act in a very bad way. Many impacts of radiation are not directly related to physical exposure. This includes socio-economic factors, stresses, and perception of risks. Say, if people are thinking of all those dangers about living in a polluted area, and about all those invisible threats, they're always under stress. And even if in cases when actual exposure doesn't take place, still there are some negative impacts on their bodies due to this stress condition. Also importantly, usually people they avoid to live in polluted areas, even if the level of pollution is recognized as a not very high one and still acceptable for people to live. like talents, they're trying to escape such areas. People, they're not coming back home after graduating from the universities. And this is really creates really huge economic and social problem. And the people, they're already punished in these areas. They live in unfavorable physical conditions, but also due to these marginalization factors, the socioeconomic conditions becoming worse and worse every year. Then when we're speaking about the actual exposure, then uncertainties can be also very high, because it is extremely difficult to model the actual exposure of human population, because the actual exposure results from many factors which are very individual to a specific family and to a specific person, like what are behavioral patterns, what you eat, where you exercise, what kind of work you do, what are your preferences in terms of lifestyle. Do you have a garden where you work, and what kind of soil you have in this garden? Do you hunt, and do you consume potentially polluted mushrooms, and so on and so forth? And it may happen that two families living on the same street with the same background level of radiation can have very different actual exposure of radioactive substances. This is measurable indeed, and people working in highly polluted areas, say in Belarus, this is Polessia Radiological Preserve, special enterprise that does forestry in high polluted areas around Chernobyl in order to prevent forest fires. In this preserve, people wear those body counters at all times, and if the radioactive exposure getting too high, they need to be evacuated as soon as possible. But you cannot provide everyone in the polluted area with such body counters, and you have here pictures illustrating this, also illustrating the perception of risks and ways people behave in polluted areas. I have a strong suspicion that the picture on the left upper corner is sort of staged, but yet it shows us quite something. You see the family happily living in this ground, the father of the family firing the pig, kids playing around, and the person in high-level chemical protection suit is measuring the level of radiation. You see, that's life, and you cannot tell people to behave the way they do not want to behave. People just want to live normal lives, and we cannot do anything about it. This was the end of our first episode of our small series about the governance and management of nuclear disaster under intense energy MOOC. Please check syllabi for literature and for the questions, and welcome to the next episodes. Thank you for attention.